travel isn't just about destinations, it's about the people you meet, the cultures you immerse yourself in, the stories you carry home. I'm Relebogile Mabocha, and on my travel feature, I take you on a journey beyond the guidebook. Each week, I connect with fellow travelers, insiders, and storytellers to bring you the heart of every place. Whether it's a hidden gem right here in South Africa or a dream destination abroad. Join me as we travel through conversations, memories, and inspiration. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
702.
Let's walk the talk on 92.7
and 106 FM.
All right. So how far is South Africa from being removed from that grey list, right? So we're in conversation now with National Treasury Advisor Ismail Momoniat to try and understand what happened. If you go back, you need to track your mind back to, I think, 2023 for some of us, when we heard about it and people were shocked, where the Financial Action Task Force confirmed that South Africa was on a grey list, and people were shocked. And as I said, when you looked at it, it was speaking about not putting in place enough instruments to make sure that money laundering and terrorism aren't a thing. That's what it was. And I think a lot of people were freaked out about what it meant, but more so about the consequences for the country's economy. So we're going to get a better understanding of that, and also look at how South Africa has fared in trying to address the issues and the red flags that were put up by the FATF. As I said, I'm joined on the line by National Treasury Advisor Ismail Momoniat. Ismail, good morning. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Tshidi, and to your listeners as well.
I want to go back in time. I'm going back to 2023 for us, because most people didn't pay attention to the issue of grey listing or even knew of the Financial Action Task Force until you heard that South Africa was placed on the grey list. Let's look at how it happened. How did South Africa end up being grey listed in the first place?
You know, I think I can assure you that most people in the world have generally, don't know what FATF is, because it's a very... it works very much undercover, and unless you're in government and dealing with money laundering, you wouldn't have heard of it. But yes, in South Africa, it's probably become better known because we got grey listed. And yes, we got grey listed largely because, I would say, because of the impact of state capture. When FATF, what it does is we're one of 40 members of FATF, but it covers all countries, even those that are not members, because everyone wants to be in the financial system. The financial system is a connected system, because you obviously want to do trade between different countries and so on. So because of state capture, our institutions like the law enforcement institutions, the police, the Hawks, the National Prosecuting Authority, SARS, as you know, were all weakened deliberately during state capture. And even though it ended, in 2019, when FATF does its review, which it does every 7 or 8 years, it found that not only were we not implementing anti-money laundering measures and on-terror financing, but our legal framework was also problematic. It had huge gaps, and if you remember, in 2015-16, the former president tried to block the concept of politically exposed persons. So all that, in a way, came home to roost, and that's why we were, I would say, the underlying reason for being grey listed.
And when we look at where we stand now, South Africa, I think, over the past few years, since the grey listing, has actually spoken out loud about attempting to deal and address those issues. Where are we now? I'm seeing reports that we've pretty much addressed at least 22. Is it just 22 that we needed to address? Where are we in terms of rectifying some of those issues and gaps in our system?
So the good news now is that, it's taken us 2 years. There's been a lot of hard work done by all the agencies affected, whether it's the law enforcement agencies, whether it's the National Prosecuting Agency, SARS, the FIC, even the Social Security Agency, State Security Agency, and many other institutions involved. We've been working together. When we were grey listed, there were 22 items that we had to deal with. And, you couldn't deal with them instantaneously. And some of them had wording like we had to show that there's a sustained increase. So they weren't going to just look at one meeting. I mean, generally we had to report 3 times a year to FATF. They tend to have 4-month cycles. And so every time we went, they wanted to know, have the figures improved from the last cycle? And they wanted to see a trend in increases. So that's why the remaining 2 that were outstanding on investigations and prosecutions, where we had to show a sustained increase, we knew that they would take it right to the end. And so after 6 or 7 reporting cycles, they were convinced that the increases that they saw from one cycle to another, generally they could call it a sustained increase, and that they have confidence that it will continue to increase in the future. And some of the other items that we were upgraded on earlier in a grey listing process, like having beneficial ownership registers, making sure that the police use the information that the Financial Intelligence Center gets from banks and other accountable institutions, making sure that the banking supervisors were tough on the financial institutions when assessing their anti-money laundering and terror-financing systems. So all of that came to the fore, and I'm happy to say that at the FATF plenary meeting last week, having got the last 2 items, we are now deemed to have been upgraded to the minimum standards required, and so we've met all 22 of the 22 items. And that's why once you've completed all the items in that, what they call the action plan, then they have an on-site visit, which we expect in the next month or 2. And thereafter, it will serve before the FATF plenary in October, which is when we expect to get to exit the grey list.
Yeah, I've been wondering about what would be the timeline going forward now that you've substantially completed all the 22 items. What do they look for with the on-site visit? You say we must expect them in a month or so, but when they are here, where do they go? What do they wish to see that would convince them that what's been presented before them is legitimate and holds water?
They will basically not go anywhere. They will just sit in one room and convene meetings with all the groups that reported on the 22 items. There were different groups for different items. So they would, have all of them in the room. Like, say, with the law enforcement agencies, they had to deal with what we call 3 strategic areas. So they would cover, let's say, about 10. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but they have at least 4 or 5 strategic areas, and they would have to report on them. And that would cover probably 10 to 12 different of the action items. And so they'll sit in a room and they'll go through each of the action items to do 2 things. Firstly, to verify the reporting that we've done, and 2, to be convinced that we can sustain these changes, these improvements in the future. And they'll have a meeting with ministers and so on to ensure that there's a high-level commitment, political commitment to continue with these. It's going to be a 2-day on-site. It's not going to, I think the hardest work has been done. We kind of just need to continue to show that what we started and what we reported on, and in a sense, pass the test, that we're continuing to pass the test.
That's very encouraging. I've got a couple of voice notes for you, so please just take a listen to some of the questions coming in from our listeners. If you've got questions for Ismail Momoniat, please feel free to send questions through to via 011-883-0702 or on 072-702-1702. Please take a listen, Ismail.
Hi, Tshidi. Can you please ask your guest that how are we out of the grey list, but we haven't implemented almost anything different from 2013 because the president himself is complaining about crime, number one. Number two, the NPA also still hasn't prosecuted any high-profile case, including money laundering and fraud. And crime is, I don't get how are we out of that while there is no new strategy that was really implemented.
All right. So, Ishmael, I think for me, that question, thank you for that WhatsApp. I think for me, that speaks to the fact that we don't feel, as ordinary citizens, the reforms that have been put in place aren't necessarily felt as tangible things by ordinary South Africans. And maybe that's what that speaks to. I mean, there's a question about our crime-fighting institutions, even if it's financial sector crimes, where people aren't convinced by what they're seeing. What is the difference that laymen aren't seeing and touching and feeling? It almost speaks about the existence of this very organization where, unless you are impacted, you know very little about its existence.
I think that question is the key question, undoubtedly. And in a sense, when you look at the FATF issue, I mean, when we are making these improvements, the issue has not been that we should just pass the test with FATF, but we need to pass the test with the people of South Africa. That have we improved the systems so that they make a difference? Now, remember, FATF only looks at a narrow set of things. Now, they look at essentially financial crimes. They don't look at non-financial crimes. They don't look... And where they look at other crimes like kidnapping and so on, they look at it from the view of what happens to the money. And through the money, have we been able to deal with those crimes? So that's the assumption, that if we can deal with the people who, say, committed kidnapping, if we can get to them through the sources of money that they collect through such a crime, can we destroy the networks around that and hence stop what's called a predicate crime, which is kidnapping in this case? So, the caller is right that, crime is a major problem in our country. I think we all feel that. And what the grey listing shows is that compared to 2019, when they did the mutual evaluation or the review of South Africa, that at least we've put in place the mechanisms, that there is now the leadership, they've got resources, they've got the budgets, and that they've got the capability, and that they've started investigating these cases, and they've also now investigating in a way where it doesn't take forever. There are some sort of timelines, and that either the case then is closed or there's a prosecution. And there's no prosecution, yes, it should be closed. This thing of a case continuing for years and years and not getting to some end stage, I think is something that the authorities had to deal with, that particular weakness. So what the grey listing issue just means is that we've begun to deal with those issues and take them up to prosecution stage. FATF doesn't deal with what happens after someone's prosecuted and on convictions. Clearly, we've seen that there have been problems recently, but and this is the key point. The FATF process just means that our authorities have begun to deal with the problem. It doesn't mean that they've solved the problem, and we are far from solving the many, many crimes that we have. But it is a big start, and I think the challenge for us is, can the authorities continue to improve so that they can deal with all those crimes, and so that we as South Africans begin to feel the difference of lower crime levels and seeing consequences. The call also mentioned high-level crimes. I think this is also clearly an issue, and on that score, there are some cases that they have brought forward, but I agree with the caller that there's still many, many cases that the Zondo Commission referred to. The government did give the formally establish the IDAC that's headed by Advocate Andrea Johnson. And we've seen some charges now that have started. Yes, these these cases seem to get challenged because when you deal with these high-profile figures, many start using Stalingrad tactics. They've got a lot of resources. It leads to all kinds of delays. And as you saw last week, even judges who seem to get the cases stunningly wrong, when the NPA managed to get an appeal on this Nunani case. So, yes, the bigger question is, how does our judicial system also deal with these cases? And can they find a way to speed it up? That is not something that FATF has looked at. But in the process of dealing with our grey listing, those are areas that we flagged that needs to be addressed in some way.
But there's a great role in what the SIU's done, I imagine, in this regard. The special investigative unit has gone after so many people, but has also gone after the money in some of these cases.
I think we need to get the role of the SIU into perspective. Remember, the SIU only comes in once there's a presidential proclamation.
Absolutely.
So they come into cases quite late. I think the bigger question is why can't, and especially to stop the money, you almost need to act instantaneously. Especially, when you deal with organized crime, people take their money outside. They take it to Hong Kong, they take it to Dubai, as we've seen with the Gupta family. And if you don't act, and once money is outside, it's very difficult to get it back. So the issue is to disrupt and to prevent that happening. And as I said, the SIU process only happens long after the crime. So one of the things that the FATF process focused on is asset forfeitures. And the issue is to get the asset forfeiture unit in the NPA to be working. And similarly, whether, the FIC has the power to freeze funds, the South African, the Financial Surveillance Department at the Reserve Bank has the power to try and freeze funds before they go outside. So to the extent that we can improve our intelligence systems and these are noted as suspicious transactions almost before they and when they happen.
So they leave our borders.
Yeah, so that they can be frozen.
Sure. Ismail,
and then the investigations can take place.
Let's speak about the financial cost, though, of a country being grey listed. I mean, you've seen it with South Africa. The impact of the ease of doing business as far as the borders are concerned. We complain about porous borders. And even now when you speak about making sure that the money doesn't get out, you try and halt it before. That becomes part of the conversation and the concern, isn't it?
Yes. Look, firstly, being grey listed was, a shame for the country.
Absolutely.
It's not something we want to be, okay? But grey listing itself formally is called by FATF that we are a jurisdiction and that's cooperating and under increased monitoring. So yes, it did impact on other banks from other countries when they deal with us, that there would be much more due diligence done on transactions with us, more documents to be called, more sort of the FICA type checks that you would see. And in some cases, it would increase the cost of trade, both in money terms, in terms of time. So it does have an impact on the economy. But having said that, the fact that we've been seen to cooperate and have been able to now deal with all 22 items, I think will reduce the impact of the economic harm. We still need to get things like our investment grade back up and deal with our fiscal vulnerabilities and so on. But at least this is a start, and hopefully lay the basis for getting more confidence from investors that their money is safe to invest in South Africa.
I've got one more voice note for you. Please take a listen.
Hi, Tshidi. Great show as usual. I do not know whether this point has been addressed in terms of the grey listing, But we've seen quite a lot of trusts in which were used in South Africa, whereby people used to hide their faces and also hide monies and possibly hide illicit activities that their companies associated with their names were doing. I think also another part that we're seeing, I do not know whether this might be linked to grey listing, but it's the area whereby we know that in property you get quite a lot of people who are wanted in certain countries for, crimes they're in which are purchasing property in South Africa and are just, hiding money therein. Just like to know if that will be addressed. Thank you. Bye.
I suppose, Ismail, this is where something like the Border Management Authority comes into play. We've complained about porous borders and the threats they pose to national security, financial or otherwise.
So, look, the Border Management Authority does have a role to play, but I think the question relates to trusts and to purchase of properties using dirty money from outside or to do sort of money laundering within the country. Yes, in our action plan, there were two items. Firstly, one, dealing with beneficial ownership for trusts and for companies. We didn't have a registry before, so we now have we've begun a registry which indicates who the beneficial owners are, the ultimate beneficiaries of a trust and of behind holdings in any company. So that information now is accessible to the law enforcement authorities. So bear in mind, all the FATF process could do is to say, set up the registries, and we've now set it up. They're still being populated. They should be, from the last I looked, they're now 30% populated, or 35%. The figure may be higher. And we are moving towards getting them all listed or registered properly. And these then are accessible for all investigations. Then it's up to law enforcement and other authorities to actually use that information to stop the abuse of trusts and so on. On the issue of purchases of property, that's precisely the type of issue estate agents have been covered. And so they are looking that when properties are sold, what's the source of that money? Banks and other institutions are compelled by our laws to try and assess the source of those funds. And if they can't assess it, they need to find measures to get that info. So, for example, if you buy a house on using cash or a big car, or even a small car, those service providers are in many instances accountable institutions, and they're compelled to report them as suspicious transactions or as cash transactions, and these get given to the FIC. And then the challenge is then to follow up on that information.
Just as a parting shot, thank you so much. The expected timeline, you did say in a month or so's time they'll be in South Africa for that in-person visit, and then to be the timeline before we are formally removed from the grey list from that point onwards, how much longer would it take?
So I'm quite confident we'll exit in October. I think that we'll pass the on-site test. We're not taking for granted. So that will happen in a month or two, and then they will submit a report to the FATF plenary in October, which is when we should exit the grey list. Can I just end by making the other point that grey listing doesn't solve all our problems. It lays the basis to solve our other problems. And next year we face a mutual evaluation, so there's going to be pressure for us to continue to improve. And I think obviously we need as a country to monitor that we as public servants are doing our job, and that there's more transparency on the speed with which we act, and that we actually achieve the objectives that the public expect us to do, and certainly bring down the high levels of crime.
Couldn't agree more with the actions that you want to take, because everybody wants to see reduced levels of crime in our country. Thank you so much. That's Ismail Momoniat, who's a technical advisor at National Treasury. It's a touch after 11:30.